Welcome to the J3U University podcast. I'm your host, John Jewett.
And I'm your co-host, Luke Miller.
Our mission is to elevate the physique coaching standard
and deliver the highest level of competitors to the stage.
Let's jump into today's episode. Optimizing growth hormone in bodybuilding. Today we have on Kurt Havens, who is a physique coach, also does a lot of research and also putting out a lot of great information around androgen information, growth hormone, all things PEDs related. I think that's kind of been the passion project for Kurt. And so if you haven't seen a lot of his information out there, happy to have him on our podcast for the first time, because that is an area that we'd love to talk about and chat on. But Kurt has his entire book that has come out on growth hormone, which was an excellent read, and recommend everyone to pick this up if you have anything to do with growth hormone, because it's delivers science and doesn't dilute it, and as an understandable takeaway, which is a hard thing to convey. So Kurt, great to have you on. Thanks. How you doing?
Excellent. Thanks for having me, guys. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of been my passion. I realized through both what was going on in social media and what was going on in modern medicine, there's just a serious lack of good information on PEDs, right? And just stigmas behind a lot of these things, and just a lot of bro lore that's just been carried on. And it's not necessarily the best way to go about doing these things, right? Because the goal is we want to be able to do this safely and do it long-term and maintain our health.
Yeah, I think with growth hormone has always been so misunderstood. And, when I was coming up in bodybuilding, it was like, growth hormone was going to be the game changer. Like, don't use this earlier on. This is your ace card to play. Like, you turn pro, use growth hormone, like opens up the gates, right? I think insulin has probably been more misunderstood, which is a whole other podcast of itself. But growth hormone absolutely is misunderstood. So I would love, and a lot of our listeners, they have heard us speak to growth hormone, but I want to get into like the depths of the conversation around some misapplications and understanding of problems that are coming up, because that's where I think you really shine. I know we could go a whole podcast probably on just mechanistic action and pathways of this, but if you could just give like a fundamental breakdown of the role of growth hormone in the body with regard to bodybuilding, right? Like muscle growth, fat loss, like what is this stuff actually doing, and maybe what it's not doing, what people are say it might be doing.
Totally. So it's secreted naturally by your pituitary gland, usually in times of stress, hunger, right? It's considered a stress hormone. It's actually a cytokine. So we can get into that later, because that plays into how you inject it and why we inject it certain ways versus other ways. And there are 5 unique genes in the human body for growth hormone, and they're all on chromosome 17. We are only really concerned with the first 2 that we see in adults. The other 3 are placental growth hormone that you see in pregnancy. And so that's a totally different thing. And that plays into some of the long-acting growth hormones that have come on the market. I touched on that in some other podcasts. That's probably a whole nother topic in and of itself, is why that's not necessarily the most ideal drug either. So growth hormone is responsible for tons of stuff, like total human body development, right? When you're growing. And for bodybuilders specifically, we're looking at it from a muscle building, fat loss, collagen, all tissue, basically, bone, liver cells, immune system, sleep. I always joke that if growth hormone only improved my sleep as much as it did, I would still use it, even if it had no other effects, because to me, the sleep benefits are so profound, especially when you get like, I'm 50. So at this point in my life, sleep is not a great thing anymore. I don't know if you guys get that yet, but when you get up there, it becomes really compromised, and it becomes difficult to get through training and recovery and manage all these things, and keep making progress into our later years. Because that's the goal here, right? Like, I want to be able to do this until I'm in my 70s, at least, in some capacity. And that's, and I think that's where using these things wisely and using things like growth hormone, I think, can really aid in that, right? Like in my opinion, the 2 healthiest things people could use would probably be testosterone and growth hormone. They're endogenous hormones, and the body knows exactly what to do with them.
Mhm.
They would produce, in theory, the least amount of side effects, even though there's things like Primobolan that are very refined. They're not natural hormones, so we don't really know long term what those drugs actually do, especially in the doses that bodybuilders take. Um,
Would you say, Kurt, like going through this, because we talk about muscle building, we talk about body composition, and with growth hormone, there's everyone thinks about the growth aspect with its naming. Would you say there's a stronger role for growth hormone of more like limiting body fat or reducing body fat over its muscle building capacity, or is it vice versa?
so that's, and I state that in my book in the beginning. It's kind of like a shocker, is that growth hormone itself is not really building muscle directly, right? There, it shows that it seems to prevent some level of protein breakdown through mTOR activation at a muscle cell, but it doesn't really increase muscle protein synthesis rates. And it's most of the effects we see are through IGF-1. So IGF-1 is really kind of the driving force between why most guys are using GH and not so much for the GH. GH itself is more of like a fat loss agent, right? And the other things like the sleep, and those sorts of effects, soft tissue, collagen, those kind of things are more from growth hormone, although IGF plays a role there too. Um, but yeah, so it's growth hormone itself is not necessarily building muscle directly. That's not why you're using it.
Yeah, so I guess that kind of gets into like the next question I had, which some people the access to growth hormone, or it's still stated the cost limitations of accessing growth hormone might be what would cause someone to go down a different path, right? Like I started because when I was going to use peptides, right, these growth hormone secretagogues, because they're very accessible. This was back in like 2015, like nearly 10 years ago. Quickly realizing like how I had to use these things and the amount that I needed to use. It's like, damn, I might as well just buy growth hormone by this point. But you brought up a couple points when you were talking around differentiating effects between GH and IGF-1, and it sounds like we definitely want both to be occurring for the fat loss aspects, but also these muscle building effects, collagen building effects. And so you still see a lot of people asking about MK677 or ipamorelin and these other secretagogues. What might you be limiting factors in some of these and be held back by trying to go this route? Like, what are your opinions and thoughts around those?
So MK677 is really interesting. So that, as last I saw, it's in stage 3 of clinical trials to become a pharmaceutical drug, and the name is changing. It won't be called MK677. That name signifies a joint venture between Merck and another peptide company. They joined to form a lot of these peptides years ago, and that's how they were all named, with those numbers and those letters. Those were like research. Same way a lot of steroids actually have research numbers on them before they become like a chemical name. Um, I think MK677 might be the most valuable of them, but not necessarily for our population. They're looking at children with delayed growth or growth hormone deficiency and elderly. So my father's in his 70s and he's had great luck with MK. The the issue with MK and all of those secretagogues, well, especially the injectable ones, is with the injectable ones like ipamorelin, you have to time your food and all these things around it, right, in order for it to even work. Um, the biggest limiting factor is it's basically like a test. It's going to work similar to a testosterone booster. Its limiting factor is your pituitary gland. So if your pituitary gland is not functioning ideally, or if you never had a huge amount, like if your body wasn't producing a ton of growth hormone to begin with, it's only going to take you to where you were naturally, right? So that's kind of the rate limit. Versus when you inject a hormone, you're bypassing that thing, right? The difference between injecting testosterone versus taking, a pro hormone or one of those over-the-counter test boosters, right? Like even if they increase your test by 40%, is that enough for us to see a result in the gym? Probably not, unless you're at the rock bottom of the range. So that's I think for bodybuilders, most likely I would say the secretagogues are pretty useless. They don't really seem to do a ton. I mean, I guess it's better than nothing, but in the current environment, it seems that you can get underground lab GH pretty reasonable now. It's changed a lot in the last 10 years, right? HCG is probably actually more expensive now than GH.
Yeah.
Probably
You know,
so.
especially the ways the laws have changed with the pharmaceutical companies making this stuff. That's, I mean, that's pretty much the, you know,
Yeah. Luke wrote a bit more on this, like in our J3U course, but looking around the research of the secretagogues, like, so, it could get a guy maybe into the 300s, like maybe high norm, but to get someone super physiological to where you really gain the benefits, it
yeah,
just seems like that's not the role. And then to your point as well, Kurt, it's like, what's your ability to produce growth hormone? And if you're a young guy in your 20s, you might already have a really good production. So you're like, just try taking this to probably maybe even produce the same amount. It's like using TRT when you're 20 years old. Like, well,
yeah.
why would you do
Why?
that?
Unless you're truly hypogonadal. Yeah, which is rare,
Right.
right? You can cause that by poor diet, lifestyle, overtraining, those kind of things. But like, which you see a lot of this TRT at these young ages, which is wild, right? I mean, I didn't start TRT till I was 40 when I was truly hypogonadal, and my body just wouldn't respond anymore, you know. And I did beat the shit out of myself. So I probably had lower test levels at a younger age, but did it really affect my training? I'd say probably not. Um, and that's kind of where using exogenous growth hormone would make a much bigger difference than using these other things. And the reason why I said before underground lab GH and not generic is just, I think we have to be careful with the term, because the term generic in a pharmaceutical sense basically means it's manufactured to the same specifications as the pharmaceutical. And unfortunately, they're not made to the same specs. They're similar, right? The drug itself is the same, but what goes into it, the process to manufacture that and bottle it and stuff is vastly different. And that's what we tend to see the difference between pharma GH and the underground lab stuff. I don't know if you want me to go into what the difference is. And there's nothing wrong with underground lab stuff, especially affordability wise, accessibility, abundance, right? Most people, especially in this country, don't have access to pharmaceutical growth hormone. And even if they did, the cost is not something they can really take on, right? Because you're looking at basically a Mercedes S-Class a month to run any good amount of pharma GH.
I do want to hit that, and this is one of my next questions, but there's a last point about like access.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about like a secretagogue, but also what's accessible. I see this promoted a lot because people can sell them. You can have a discount code and you can push it. Is IGF-1 DES, IGF-1 LR3. Like these are all really popular as well, which there's limiting aspects around this. And so I also wanted you to be able to touch on those as well.
I in my experience and in my knowledge, those variants of IGF are not going to be as effective. In rodent studies, they seem to do much more than in humans. In the practical realities, I don't know anyone that's used any of those IGF variants and really got much out of it. I would say again, if you're going to go the pure IGF route, it seems that Increlux is kind of the way to go. But again, the cost, right, abundance, especially in the United States, it's really hard to come by, and it's probably more for a very advanced user. I would say, in my mind, working with athletes at different levels, I'd say incorporating something like Increlux comes way at the later stages, like where you are, John, when you're looking at the difference in 1% is the difference in you winning the Olympia versus, not winning the Olympia versus at a local show. I highly doubt that that's going to be the game changer there for most of those guys.
Yeah, I'm just pounding down Increlex over here, of course.
I would say that that's where you typically would see it, but it's more in the European guys. I think
Yeah,
just more abundant over there.
Yeah, I've seen like some Middle Eastern countries like have access around these things, but even the guys that I personally have never used Increlex, but the guys that I have spoken to, it's kind of the same thing. It just doesn't have a real profound effect. I do think, and I think going back to our original thing, where if you're just trying to take IGF-1, we talk about, oh, this is what we're really after for bodybuilding. And I think that is not the only thing we are really after, because I think the real benefit is growth hormone itself, both, right? To be able, because my experience is in the off season, this is the leanest I've ever been able to stay. So the indirect effect to be able to partition more towards muscle is how I get the muscle building effects. Yes, IGF-1 has a role, right? But it's really, I think, the growth hormone's indirect effects of partitioning ability that create such a profound response. And you're missing out on that, I think, with just taking like
Correct.
something like Increlex. And you've probably seen the studies on Increlex, because what Increlex is actually utilized for, like children deficient in growth hormone that are non-responsive, like they have
Yeah.
some type
The
of
liver's wrong.
defect or error to where they don't have IGF-1 occurring, and so they use Increlex. And the dosage of those studies, like, man, to have replacement amount of IGF-1, you wouldn't be able to afford it. And I see the protocols of what guys take. It's like
2
it's
milligrams a
like
day or something.
a tenth of what's even
Like a
effective.
bottle a
So
day. Yeah, it's hugely expensive. And we try, and in HIV, the same thing. We've studied Increlux versus using Ceristim, and the outcome is just not as great. Like you're just getting so much more out of the GH, in those people. And that's on an extreme end. But if you look at that, if it can grow new cells and stop wasting in someone that's terminally ill like that, you have to figure for someone like us who's clearly not, you're not sitting in a bed, you're not wasting away, you're not expressing all these catabolic genes. It's going to have I just think an overall better effect than just using something like IGF.
I think one of the things on the anecdotal side of like growth hormone usage is like John, you mentioned like stringing like seasons together, like being able to manage body composition, kind of being like the primary input of where we see the applicable usage being extremely high. I've actually been using it pretty well though in keeping people training from an injury profile perspective on the collagen synthesis side of the equation. Actually, pretty robustly getting people back to training post injury with combination of like TB500 BPC alongside growth hormone usage, kind of going down that collagen synthesis route. So I kind of wanted to let you touch on that real quick before we got into the access stuff, because like the secondary effects of growth hormone are where like it's so robust as a coach, being able to manage someone. And we talked about this in a previous podcast, like John's body composition comments about I can take someone through an all-season phase and longer. I can keep them exposed to physiological androgens longer because I'm managing body composition better, and as a result, health metrics. I'm stringing along seasons better because I can keep them in a better body comp, but I can keep them training more effectively too because I'm getting them out of injury profiles or niggles a bit quicker because of the collagen synthesis side of the equation. So I just wanted to let you touch on that because I think that's I don't want to say underutilized, but maybe under discussed or under realized potential benefit of keeping that in play as well.
Yeah. And having seen John in person in the middle of an off season, like I saw you last year at the Arnold, your condition all year round is phenomenal. I don't even think the pictures do it justice that you post on Instagram. I mean, you look like you're ready to get on stage all the time, which is quite a feat for someone your size and the sheer amount of food, that you have to eat just to make progress at your,
yeah. It wasn't like that before. I've gotten fat, so people think like you're just lean. I'm like, no, man, I'm not. Like
No, but I mean, doing stuff correctly, it's amazing.
yeah,
But that's I think how you were able to move up weight classes so quickly and so smoothly, year after year.
yeah, and I think Luke has a good thing to bring up around this because we're talking about peptides, right?
Mhm.
And like everyone jumping on like BPC or
Mhm.
TB500 to
Mhm.
like, oh, I had this injury, let me throw this in. And I personally, I've just seen so much more response at a growth hormone than BPC or TB500. It just seems like it's all over the place. Like some people notice it, some people don't. I think there's a lot of placebo maybe happening there, but
Yeah. I've never personally seen a ton of. I think that there is some merit to using BPC and TB500. TB500 is very like acute, like you literally just injured yourself.
Yeah.
That's a great time for TB500. BPC is probably more like like a nagging thing that's been around for a while. It might aid in that recovery to some degree, right? How much is hard to say, and I think, like you said, it probably depends on the person and the injury, right? If something's fully torn, it's not going to fix it.
Yeah.
But GH, I think, has a much more profound effect on recovery and healing. It just needs to be used long term, right? Collagen synthesis doesn't really start to ramp up. It's kind of a biphasic response. It doesn't really start to ramp up for about 6 months after use, and then again at another big ramp up at a year. So if someone's using growth hormone for a prep or something, they're only going to use it for 2 or 3 months. They're probably not even getting anywhere near the full benefits of it. Right? It's just starting to build
Yeah.
at that point. But I think you could definitely use all three together if you actually have an injury or coming out of surgery or something.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
kind of weigh like what is the risk of not using versus using them, right? And like,
Yeah.
these aren't FDA approved drugs, but we do have quite a bit of research nonetheless, probably more than in the past of what is even an FDA approved
Yeah,
drug.
exactly.
So people should keep that in mind when they're like, we only use human approved drugs. It's like, yeah, but even the current ones are probably even stricter to come to market and for specific reasons that sometimes they don't pan out. But anyway, yeah, I think those probably are like lower from growth hormone, probably like our next like tier
Yeah.
of peptides that probably have some good efficacy. But
The rest of the stuff is who knows, hit or miss, right? I've never really seen many people have much luck with a lot of the other stuff that's out there. Probably
yeah.
wasted money. And if you're going to spend thousands of dollars on these random peptides, I would probably just invest in growth hormone at that point.
Yeah.
Now there was a study. I don't know if you recall. I'll have to send it to you. It was in young individuals, dosing, I believe, and they actually showed like within a 14-day period a ramp up of collagen synthesis with using growth hormone. Now this is just means like, hey, some mRNA increases of collagen synthesis, but to pan out to an actual effect that you're
Yeah,
noticing is going to be some time, right? It's
time to
like
time.
you're saying, it's not going to be the next week. It's like I'm healed, right?
Yeah.
It's takes some time to
Well,
actually
and
come to
that's the
fruition.
issue with mTOR and protein synthesis and nitrogen retention, all these things. These were metrics we used years ago to determine if a drug was efficient or not. And it turns out that just retaining nitrogen, while it might prevent some catabolism or it's stimulating mTOR, like leucine, right? Stimulates mTOR. That doesn't mean you're growing muscle from eating leucine.
Right.
There's not. So just stimulate. And when they studied, it's really difficult to figure out if that's protein synthesis in a muscle or if that's whole body protein synthesis, right? That's a big
Yeah.
determining factor too. So it's not that you don't want to keep your protein synthesis elevated to some degree if you're trying to grow, but in and of itself, it's not going to be the stimulus for growth. Like there's only 4 pathways that we know of that cause growth of muscle in humans, and unfortunately, mTOR is not directly one of them. Right? It's mechanotransduction from exercise. It's the androgen receptor, the IGF-1 receptor, and P13K, which is an energy sensor that insulin and IGF and all those things can interact with as well as food, but it's downstream from mTOR. But mTOR itself is not going to cause, right? You could drink all the protein you want, you're not going to grow.
It's with all these studies, like we learn about how something works in a path. It's not the thing that we want to just put all of our programming into, right? So it's like, yeah, like your PI3K pathway, right? It does influence mTOR. Great. What does that actually mean for us to implement in our routines? But um, to bring this back of something that you were about to get into, that I just kept us in a rabbit hole of peptides, was around growth hormone access.
Mm-hmm.
And the question we get a lot is, how do I know my GH is real? Which is a simple answer yet a challenging answer because there's a lot
Yeah,
of nuance there.
I would say you could do a GH pulse, right? You could do lab work to see. You could possibly test IGF. Again, IGF, we can touch on IGF in serum if you want later, and I can kind of explain kind of the misunderstanding there with that test. I would say, I mean, really simple. Growth hormone's fairly dramatic. When it's good, you would know that your growth hormone is good. I think the first sign is when the dose is adequate that your sleep should start to become much deeper and you start to have really vivid dreams. And you see that even on things like MK677, they start to have really strange dreams. Um, I think from a body composition point of view, when you use an adequate amount of growth hormone for your body, and everyone just responds to different amounts, right? There are guys that can use 4 or 5 units and get fantastic results, or other guys that might use a bottle a day. Um, I I would say it's fairly apparent though when it's working, when you use the right amount. I'm sure you noticed, right, when you started using it, it became obvious really quickly.
Enough of it. And but I guess the challenge around that is you have to be fairly uh, introspective and aware, and someone earlier on might not have that kind of awareness, right? So like when I raised up my dosage, this is when I'm seeing things happen that wouldn't make sense before, right? Like body weight's increasing, I'm
Yeah,
not seeing fat gain. You're like, wow, okay, I'm seeing this visually happen. You feel fuller,
yeah.
right?
You get a fuller
um
look. The
I get
veins, right? Increases nitric oxide, so you can have bigger, thicker veins on it.
I guess the thing that I would be careful with is that a lot of people see if drugs are working based on their also their we say other effects, because they're
Mhm.
not just side effects or negative effects, they're just all effects, right? That, oh man, my hands are swollen, or that my hands are tingling, or man, my fasted blood glucose is sky high. It's like those aren't ways that we want to chase down to make sure
No,
your growth hormone is real. Like, you don't really want the other effects to be happening. Same with like trenbolone, right? Oh man, my sleep's terrible. Like, I got some good tren now. Like, no, or you're just taking too much.
much, or you don't tolerate it, right? I think
Yeah,
that's another thing that people have to understand is like not everyone can take aspirin, not everyone can take tren, not everyone can take growth hormone. You might not tolerate it. It's just because you get a negative effect doesn't mean that it's working, right? So if a guy, and I'm not harping on microdosing stuff, but if a guy's taking 10 milligrams of tren and he's feeling it, does that mean it's an effective dose because you get a side effect? No. If you took, right, amoxicillin is dosed at 500 milligrams. If you took half of an amoxicillin and you broke out in hives, does that mean the bacteria in your body's going away? No, it means you have a side effect. You're allergic to the drug. So you shouldn't be using that drug. That's kind of the thing with steroids. We shouldn't be chasing sides to figure out what efficiency is.
yeah, and that doesn't also mean you're going to have a great growth response to it,
No,
right? You
no.
could just have a poor resilience to side effects. I've had clients where they get like take steroids, they take all the negative effects, and they do not respond like from a muscle building standpoint. And but
Well,
if you went off side effects, you're like, man, this guy's going to have a great response. Like, nope, that's not always the case at all. So
no, well, because especially with the steroids, you have multiple places for this androgen receptor. So non-genomic stuff on the cell surface is going to cause most of the side effects, and those are located on organs in your brain. That's when guys take tren and they feel awful on it. It doesn't mean that it's actually causing any sort of gene transcription, right? You could have a polymorphism or be totally lacking in a classic AR and not get any response from tren, but you could really feel it, right? Same with testosterone, it can make you a nervous wreck. It doesn't mean it's doing anything. Most likely, the guys that seem to respond the best will grow on the smallest amounts, but they can also tolerate bigger amounts,
yes,
right? And I think that's why amongst pro bodybuilders, you see variations in amounts of drugs taken, right? And it's because someone like yourself could probably grow on 400 milligrams, but you could also take 4,000 milligrams and be okay. Versus guys that have poor responses have it across the board, right? They have it at their first injection and they have it no matter what you do with their dose. It doesn't ever get any better. And the response doesn't change. Same with GH. Like if your hands go numb at 2 units, most likely something is off, right? We got to look at a couple things: hydration, sodium intake, um, maybe bringing it back down and then trying again, or maybe it's just not the right drug for you.
yeah, you could just have more robust that like sodium, potassium, ATPase, like influence that growth hormone has, or even all aldosterone. You retain more water, that could
Yep.
be problematic. But to go back around this testing piece, because I remember like I used to read on the forums that was out of like, well, how do you test your growth hormone, right? And like it was out that you do 10 IU and intramuscular injection, and then the growth hormone peaks around 3 hours after this administration. You go pull your labs and you see what your serum GH level was, and if you had a baseline to compare off of, maybe you would just know like, all right, this is the response, but you can't really say the amount of growth hormone that was being present. But then also you later find out, well, these companies are like adding in peptides to their growth hormone to where maybe you're seeing a response and it's not just from our HGH. Maybe it's like also added with some GHRP6 or something in there.
Or DES, or they could put like cheaper IGF DES or something in there, right? So
Sure.
make than growth hormone itself. Yeah, and serum. Do you want me to touch on serum?
I do. I do. I think before, I guess the only real way that I would say would be an HPLC test, sending off
Oh,
your
for
vial
teeth.
of growth hormone to be able to say like this is the
Right.
purity, the potency, the
Timber.
dimer, all these
Yeah.
aspects that would be there. And geez, if you get plugged into the right areas, you can find a lot of these testings that have been already done for a
Yeah.
lot of
You don't necessarily need to
reputable
retest.
companies that have been out
Yeah.
for a while. It just be around the right people for long enough, and you start will finding these things out. But yes, the testing piece. So some people are also just looking at serum IGF-1, and so dive into this because if you're taking exogenous growth hormone, it's going to raise up your serum IGF-1. What does that mean for us with response or even growth hormone quality?
Yeah. Well, I'll back up 1 second with the testing
Mhm.
before we close that out. I think where the difficulty in understanding the difference between a pharma and an underground lab GH2 is, ideally you want it to be as pure as possible, right? You're really looking for 98% pure or better. Um, and you ideally want as low of a dimmer as possible. In this case, that word can mean a ton of things depending on what science you're talking about. In this case, we're talking about like broken protein strands in there that are just not GH anymore. There's something else. Who knows what they are? Um, where the trouble starts, even if you had an underground lab GH that's 98% pure, 99% pure, and it's just at the correct milligram amount, what happens is they add some binders and fillers to it that can affect the absorption. And the rate limit for growth hormone, like you said about testing your blood, is how much you can absorb, right? So when you put things like Baloxone 188, which is a polymer, into it, it slows down the absorption. So you're not getting the whole amount. It'll stay. A lot of times you can see it in cheaper GH when you inject it. It'll leave a lump that'll last for a while. It's just not absorbing properly versus pharma GH. When you put it in, it'll leave a lump immediately and then it absorbs in a couple minutes. The other thing is mannitol is typically added, which is a diuretic. It's a non-potassium sparing diuretic, and it's used to aid the freeze drying process. So when genotropin is made or Ceristim is made, it's freeze dried in very expensive equipment. And in the underground labs, they don't have access to that equipment. So what they do is they add mannitol to it to speed up the drying process so they can make it into a little puck and put it in a bottle and get it out the door. And that mannitol screws with the sodium potassium ratio and can cause side effects to get worse. So sometimes you might see guys will use 3 or 4 units of an underground GH, and they'll get incredibly numb hands that you wouldn't see on a pharma one until you got to like 8 or 10, right? And it's not going to necessarily improve over time because the mannitol's in there. Because normally, what I'd recommend when guys get numb hands if they're using pharma GH is start reducing some of the sodium in your diet, or just be very mindful of what you're taking in, and increase your water intake. If you're not already someone like yourself who's already very mindful of how many electrolytes you're taking in and how much fluid that's a time to start paying attention to it. And some of it will go away with time as your body gets used to filtering at a different rate. Okay, so with the IGF serum stuff, so the test was not designed for athletes. So it was never meant for us. It was meant for disease states. So when a doctor originally was looking at this, which would primarily be an endocrinologist, they were looking for acromegaly or giantism or growth hormone deficiency or a pituitary adenoma, which is a non-cancerous tumor that's pressing on the pituitary that's causing either, like a hypersecretion. Um, that's really what they're looking for, because there is no direct correlation between your serum IGF and what you're going to look like, right? We see this all the time in athletes. Chase Irons is a great example of this, because when he was doing his 18 units of Ceristim a day, his serum IGF was in the low hundreds. He was growing like a weed because most of that IGF was going inside of his muscles, so it wasn't detectable in serum. And what really is going to determine that is your binding protein. So in response to GH, your liver secretes, in humans, 7 binding proteins. Number 7 is debatable if it exists or not, or if that's actually what it is. But so we know of 6 for sure. Your liver will respond by producing these binding proteins, and each binding protein has a different function. They'll limit where it can go or what organ it goes to, so your body can regulate how it's going to grow. So there's just not this like free for all of growth. And certain things will increase or decrease them. And one of the common ones you see is in bodybuilding is as guys' estrogen rises, their IGF and serum rises. And they're like, well, this is why we run our estrogen high in the off season, because look at my IGF, it's at an 800. And meanwhile, that doesn't mean it's actually entering the cell, it's completely bound. So that's nature's way of preventing IGF in pregnant women from going to the fetus. So you see during pregnancy, as her estrogen goes higher and higher as the pregnancy goes on in stages, it will bind up more of her natural IGF, and also her pituitary will produce less. So the placenta can start producing more, because you don't want that IGF to cross over to the fetus. But you see that in bodybuilders as well. So if they run a huge amount of aromatizing drugs and they're letting their estrogen run wild, you'll see their IGF go up in serum, which is rendering most of it useless. So just seeing it in serum might show that you have injected growth hormone, but it's not showing that you're going to get any muscle growth out of it directly. So I don't really love to test. It's like most of the serum tests don't really show us anything. DHT in serum isn't really teaching us anything. Technically, estradiol in serum is only telling us what's in the blood. It's not telling us what the cell is doing with the estrogen and how fast it's converting. So some of these tests are just misunderstood, and they're and the TRT clinics are now using them as metrics to determine an outcome, but yet it wasn't designed for that.
I guess you have to kind of corroborate the story of if you have a serum marker, it's not the sole thing to go off of, but also what is the presentation and response that you're noticing. Then what other markers might be helping you to assess that? Because, like you said, these intracellular conversion or expression of hormones is probably what's really deeming response. However, there could be some association, right? We see this with. I was looking at some studies around bone growth and
Mm-hmm.
using growth hormone, and also around estradiol and suppressing estradiol, lowering serum IGF-1, also lowered localized IGF-1 in bone and didn't cause as much growth. Now, is that a 1-to-1 ratio? What is it? We don't know. Could there be some like, hey, if your serum IGF-1's higher, could you also get more local IGF-1? Possibly. Could it be completely unrelated for someone like, say, Chase?
Totally.
Sure. It might give you some marker of like, okay, you took this and it has a rise. What does this mean? It might not mean much. So again, I don't think it. I have people ask me all the time of like, hey, I'm taking this much growth hormone. Look at my serum IGF-1. Like, is that good? Is that bad? It's like, gosh, it's like, I wouldn't weigh much into it. And like we just spoke to earlier, is that I really think still the big benefit here is growth hormone, and that response in IGF-1 to a lesser degree. Because with Chase, right, you could make the case like, is Chase getting more localized IGF-1, or is it just that he has a very great, robust growth hormone response?
Yeah, probably both.
Maybe it's both, right? It's hard to pinpoint it down. So you're kind of looking at like, okay, what is just your response? And that's why you should be monitoring and tracking pretty effectively. So to just like give like specific recommendations around, like you mentioned, right? Run your estradiol as high as you can to have more HGH to IGF-1. It's like that's kind of misguided. There's a lot more to that, and we could probably do a whole podcast just pulling that whole conversation apart. But yeah, I think with serum IGF-1 testing, it's not going to be your best guide to your response, right?
Yep.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to today's podcast. Are you struggling to hit your peak on show day? Feeling lost in the off season? Upgrade your coaching game with J3 University. Our program covers everything from off season to contest prep to peak week, all based from real client results. Along with our comprehensive physique curriculum, you'll also get access to our forums with our J3U team to answer any questions you have, and live Q&A sessions to further your coaching and athlete experience. We are the source of education for top IFBB pros and coaches. Join us to elevate the coaching standard at J3 University. Let's get back to today's podcast.
It shows us something, but what it's showing us, it's a part of a puzzle, right? I mean, like I said initially, I think using the mirror is going to be your best guide, right? My IGF. So I have the kidney issue. I'm not going to go too much into it, but I have a prescription for growth hormone for that kidney issue. So it's not necessarily on label, but it can be used for chronic kidney disease. When initially I started using it, my EGFR was only a 40, which is pretty awful. And my IGF serum was really high. It was like almost an 800. And part of that is with one kidney, you don't filter GH. I'm not breaking it down and excreting it as fast. So it's basically recirculating again. And then the body's trying to protect me from it by binding it more and leaving it there. But I wasn't large. I was 140 pounds at the time. So clearly having an 800 IGF wasn't causing any sort of the growth expression there. GH has actually almost completely fixed my kidney. My EGFR non-adjusted with cystatin C is now 108.
Interesting.
So my one kidney functions better than most people's two kidneys, especially at my age. And that's not taking the 220 pounds that I weigh now into account either.
Yeah, I can't even, it's probably too many variables for me to state along that lines, but I usually would always have elevated creatinine, and we know that's not a great marker, but nonetheless, it's been normal for the past like year and a half. And it could be completely unrelated. Possibly, I have really good astragalus or something, but it very well maybe there's something is around
It
that.
grows new nephrons. It increases filtration rate. I mean, that's one of the benefits of using growth hormone.
An interesting thing I wanted to add on, Kurt, is that during like my last 2 weeks for the Olympia prep, I pulled my labs, and this was like, and I also pulled them like 6 weeks after the show. The same estradiol level, same growth hormone amount, but my serum IGF-1 was vastly different. Like I was in the 300s versus being in the 600s.
Mm-hmm.
And it just goes to show that you have multiple influencers that are going to probably affect this serum level. Like my cortisol was up pretty high. Like that could
Glucose.
be an impactor, or could have been like I'm in a more dieted state. Potentially there's less like binding proteins and you're seeing less in the serum. But maybe again, like it's like, does that
There's
reflect
so many.
my had a poor batch of growth hormone? Like, no, that's
Yeah.
not what that means either. So
No, it's, and one of the main factors in IGF production is glucose, right? Glucose and protein are going to be the two biggest stimulators of IGF production. So if you're dieting going to Olympia, most likely your carbohydrates were not at your normal amount. I'm assuming that you pulled them down. So you're not going to see necessarily, the same IGF response that you're going to see as you enter your off season. But again, what is that? There's no reflection on what's in that bottle of growth at all. It might not even affect the outcome of how you look.
yeah, right.
We don't know. And that's the thing when we all look at labs, right? We all coach, we all look at these things. Labs are much more complicated than just looking at a number and a range, right? All of those things, especially the endocrine system, play off each other. And there's tons of ways that they all interact. And it's not sometimes as simple as just one number, right? Like what's causing something to be off. We could do a video one time on how to read all the endocrine markers.
Oh my gosh, right? People love going over lab work. I do want in this episode, because I know I only have like 15 minutes with you, is to give some people some real takeaway that are utilizing growth hormone that run into problems because they're there. It's real simple to take growth. I want to have a great response. But a lot of times what you're doing in the coaching world is like, hey, this happens. What do I do? Like, I can't tolerate this. And so that's a lot of like the coaching tricks that start coming in play, which I think the biggest one you'll hear about, and I guess I didn't have this on our question list, but was hand numbness and issues waking up, sleeping. And that seems like, I can't even tolerate this stuff. Do you have any suggestions around this aspect to maybe make from not happening to begin with? Or once it is happening, what do you do from there?
So I would say, I mean, we can go over all the best practices as we know, right? And again, there's no, like most things, there's no absolute. Like the response I'm going to give doesn't mean that that's 100% right all the time. Medicine is based on averages, and I can't speak to every person watching this video, right? Because we're all unique, and even amongst the three of us, we might respond totally different to different things. I would say with the easiest way to just not even get the numb hands to begin with, or prolong it as long as possible, is to start really low, right?
Okay.
Now, I was just going to back up for a second. The majority of this conversation is geared toward men. So growth hormone, like other hormones, is sexually dimorphic, meaning it responds differently in men versus women. Women's response to growth hormone is significantly different, and these dosing and the advice isn't necessarily the same for women. People can reach out to me if they have questions for females, because the dosing is, and the utilization and the tolerance, all these things are very different. So for men, I would start low. Start at 2 or 3 units, right? And stay there for a couple of weeks. It doesn't, if you don't feel anything, it's fine. Stay there and then go up and go by single units, right? Go up to, if you start at 3, try 4, and then stay there for a couple of weeks and go up really slowly. If you reach a point where all of a sudden your hands start to go numb, the first thing I would do is back off to the previous dose for a couple of weeks. A lot of times then when you go back up to that dose, it's gone, right? It's just, again, your kidneys are getting used to this new amount of sodium. So growth hormone causes sodium, phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium retention. Sodium is going to be outside of the cell, and that's what's going to cause the hand numbness. It's going to compress the medial and the brachial nerve inside the wrist. It looks like an emergency brake on a car. Like if you've ever seen an emergency brake, it's a cable inside of a sleeve. The sleeve is there to protect it. The nerves run through a sleeve. The sodium basically compresses the sleeve and pushes on the nerve. And nerves taper as they get toward the ends of your hand. So they're very tiny, and they're going to be sensitive to that stuff. It's not necessarily like a diabetic neuropathy that if you read some of these side effects, that's not exactly what that is, and nor is it technically carpal tunnel syndrome, because it's not causing the straps to grow. It's just compression from sodium. So I'd start low, and like I said previously, revisit like the amount of sodium and potassium you're taking in your diet. A lot of guys, especially in the last 5 or 10 years, have really increased their sodium intake, expecting something out of that sodium's probably not going to do. Just be cognizant of what you're taking in, the seasoning you're using, and those sorts of things. You might need to significantly reduce that in order to not get those sides, and potentially either add potassium-rich food in your diet, or you can even use a supplement, as long as you're very careful, right? You don't want to. Potassium is one of those things you have to be very mindful of the dose, and go by lab work. Like get them both, where they're in the proper range. We don't ever see anyone in the emergency room that comes in like. You come into the emergency room, labs are run, right? You never see anyone sodium deficient unless there's something severely wrong. So it's in America, at least, or first world countries, generally people aren't sodium deficient. So most guys probably don't need to add a ton of salt to their diet, right? Unless they're sweating a ton or doing, so that's another place I would start.
Yeah, usually your serum sodium is more reflective of fluid status over your actual sodium intake status.
Yeah, so if someone's super dehydrated, their sodium level might be super low,
Right.
but you see that in chloride as well, too. That generally goes down as well when fluid is off.
But I think you give great insight here, Kurt, because if you know how something works, kind of know what to address. So what is the issue? It's like water retention. And so if you're retaining more water, this is why those aspects are occurring. To address it, well, yeah, lower your dose and hold it there. Because I think with a lot of these issues around growth hormone, say with blood glucose rise, it's kind of transient. Like it kind of comes up and then it stabilizes and you start regulating it, just like a new water, a balance in the body. Like you regulate it, you get used to it, right? I think you bring up another great point around what do bodybuilders do in the off season that might be altering their fluid balance. Is like, well, food gets higher. What do you drop out? No veggies. There's like no potassium. Then also you have more variations in your diet. Sodium fluxes that causes more shifts in your water balance too, and can lead to those problems. And I think the last thing that you brought up, what I hear guys that have that problem, is that they just jump into growth hormone with a high dose, and then the problem.
And you guarantee you're going to have side effects if you go right to it. And it's I did that myself. I went from 3 to 6 to 9 within a month, and I couldn't even feel my hands. I had to go back to 6. I stayed at 6 for a little bit, and then I went back to 9. I have not had a problem since. It just, that was just dumb. I was trying to rush something, and it wasn't working.
Now, this is a lot of people knows this around sleep, and so on the topic of sleep, we do usually see the growth hormone improve sleep.
Mm-hmm.
However, I have these individuals that have reached out, and clients too, where they have like poor sleep on growth hormone. And it seems rare, of course, and it seems counterintuitive, but nonetheless, like you have them not take growth hormone, they're like, yeah, I sleep better. And I don't know if you've encountered this because it's rare. And if there's I don't even know if we know the explanation around this. Maybe it's around blood glucose regulation or something.
Could be. So it's generally either going to be blood glucose, right? Or they could be eating too late, close to bed. It's usually going to be a blood sugar thing, or it's possible that the dose versus what the pituitary is putting out is not adequate. So I've seen in younger guys, if they take 3 units, for instance, even though it's a milligram, it's possible that by the time they absorb it and it gets in the system, that it's less than their brain was naturally producing, and it's going to actually cause worse sleep, right? In that case, if all the other things are addressed, something you could try is maybe try to take it in the afternoon, maybe try to take it in the morning then, and see if that actually helps your sleep. I would say best practice, though, with growth hormone administration, and this is just from the last 50 years of studying the drug and how it's used medically. So you have risk versus reward with anything, right? Not to say that you couldn't use it other ways, but it seems the most practical, safest way to use it is to take your entire dose at night before bed, right? So you have no food. By the time it absorbs, your gut is clear, you have no food. In men specifically, that's your biggest bolus that's going to be secreted. So it's mimicking what your body would naturally be doing. Your IGF and stuff will still be elevated in the morning. So if you're doing fasted cardio, you're still in a great place. Versus if you take it during the day, you can run into blood sugar issues, right? Because now you're blunting some of the ability to take in glucose into the cell. Fatigue. I don't know if you ever got that. I tried to split up 18 once. I was taking 18 units and I wanted to split it up throughout the day just to see. And I literally couldn't I couldn't stand for more than a couple minutes without feeling tired. So I was sitting all day. So it's not a really practical use to do anything if you can't actually get anything done. Versus when you take it at night, you typically don't experience those things. If you talking about blood sugar, I know you mentioned this before with the video. Blood sugar versus is the blood sugar rise a concern? So it doesn't seem so. So we're taught that we generally don't even look at fasting glucose outside of someone who's diabetic who has to figure out how to dose their insulin. A1C is a much better predictor of what's actually going on because you have tons of things that go on in the human body that can affect glucose, from stress to sleep to dawn effect. So it's not always the greatest thing. As long as your A1C is staying, in the low fives, generally not a concern, because sometimes with growth hormone, you will see your fasting glucose go up, but as a long-term trend, as long as it's not staying like that, it's not a concern.
Yeah,
Right? You get an average of 10 points up from fasting glucose from growth hormone in most people. But that doesn't
for
mean
sure.
that it's going to increase.
You take it at night, it's in your system for 10 to 12 hours. You're going to wake up maybe 8 hours later. Growth hormone's still having action of raising blood glucose and insulin higher. It's going to be there. You kind of almost want that to happen, as that is part of its transition to its anabolic role. Interesting thing around sleep is, like, I was talking to someone and they were having problems with feeling lethargic during the day, and taking growth hormone at night kind of went down this, path of like timing, etc. And I think even with our last topic around hand swelling, is we look straight to like the root issue of like, at first is what it should be. But a lot of times we look at like kind of the superficial one, like growth hormone. What do I do with this? Well, what's also happening in the off season, right? You're gaining body weight, you're retaining more water, sleep quality is probably going down, potentially around sleep apnea. So talking with one individual, he had sleep apnea and he just wasn't wearing his mask. And as he's gained like 20 pounds, it's gotten worse. He's more lethargic during the day. It's like, that's probably your issue over the growth hormone, which I think a lot of guys, that could be the problem in the off season, and not your growth hormone making you feel lethargic all day. I don't know if that is an application. We talk about someone with poor sleep potentially, and is it around blood glucose? Maybe that is like a PM dosing of Lantus for
Could be
a specific case. I haven't played around with that enough because that situation is very rare.
Mm-hmm.
But it maybe potentially. Also, we've seen like split dosing of shifting a little bit to the AM doesn't have as much influence on blood glucose, and would just lower your total dose in the evening.
I'm just saying, like, if you were to pick one simple way.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the things I try to do with fitness is I try to make it as simple as possible, because if I'm going to tell people to inject something 6 times a day, who is doing that? Like, you're really traveling with your GH everywhere you go. You're doing it at work. You're like, to simplify it, I think it's easier just to take it at night. You're going to get the same effect as you would, give or take, by splitting it up. And you're most likely less health problems, at least for the average person. That doesn't mean that that's always the answer for everyone, though. So the last thing I was going to say about best practices is with all peptides, and insulin included, you don't want to inject it intramuscular. So when you lose about 20% when you put a peptide into a muscle, and growth hormone specifically doesn't, the growth hormone receptor on muscle it's not translocating in like an androgen receptor. It's a cell surface thing, and it's acting on downstream pathways like mTOR that are inside the cell. When you put growth hormone into a muscle cell, because growth hormone is related to it's a cytokine, your body senses an immune response and it tries to kill the growth hormone. And you might end up with, so you see guys that get welts and all sorts of strange side effects from growth hormone. So generally not the best idea to be sticking it in a muscle. It's why you see across the board in all the pharmaceutical brands, it always is used sub-Q. But again, it's if people want to do what I am, then so be it. You can do what I am. That just doesn't make a ton of sense, because that's not how the drug was designed. It's pretty similar to injecting testosterone sub-Q. I'm not really a big fan of putting oil under my skin either. But again, if that's
it's super low tolerance, like it'd have to be a very, very low amount. Is what I've found, but changes the pharmacokinetics as well a bit too. Same with growth hormone. I know some people brought up the idea of like, if you're going to do, say, a daytime dosing, using intramuscular, because you get a quicker rise, put it around training, maybe less impact around blood glucose for the entire day. Is that like looking at the tree and missing kind of the forest
Probably,
aspect?
probably.
Probably. I
You're
think,
losing 20%. Like unless you just have money, coming out of your ass, it seems like kind of a waste to make any drug less efficient.
and really,
I don't
like
think
I've
that
done
works.
it. I've done it injectable carnitine, right? Is intramuscular.
Yeah.
Doing sub Q, oh geez, who can tolerate it? But what do you stop? I stopped using it because I want one less damn intramuscular injection. So just do it sub Q. You're at your GH. Like it's completely
And it
applicable
can be
that
anywhere.
way.
It doesn't have to be on the stomach. You
Yeah.
see tricep, you can do it on your thigh. Anywhere you can grab skin, you can put it. It doesn't matter. It's going to absorb, right? That's another bro. And there's no really like localized growth. That's inflammation that you see when you stick it in. When you stick a drug into a muscle, that's not necessarily causing some sort of cellular response at the muscle. There might be some tiny little acute amount, but it's not over the course of your bodybuilding career. It's not going to net you any more growth. In fact, it might just put scar tissue somewhere that's going to limit your growth or change the shape of that muscle, right? Like you see guys with glutes that are really jacked up from too many injections or shoulders that are jacked up.
Yeah.
So I would just minimize, as like you said, as many things as you can inject into your muscle as possible.
Yeah, no, these last segment are all great like takeaways for everyone, Kurt. And I know we're at time, so I want to just give you a moment because I mentioned about your growth hormone book, but also for people that want more information about you, or if you do individualized coaching or anything that you'd like to speak to, please take the floor. Let us know where we can find more information on you and your business.
Uh, I'm on Instagram at Kurt.Havens, YouTube Kurt.Havens. Unfortunately, I don't get a ton of time to make my own content anymore. I need to start doing that again. Um, I'm on a bunch of other people's podcasts like Figure Steve, here, Dr. Dean. I have a forum. I coach. It's atomiclifecoaching.com if people are looking for coaching or consultations. And I have a forum as well because I understand a lot of people can't afford to just hire a coach or pay for a consult, but they need some sort of help. And I'm trying to help as many people as I can. So forum is like a low price point entry so that you can, I'll still interact. I can answer simple questions and stuff. And it's a good community there. That's forum.atomiclife.coaching. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Most of
Yeah,
my time
and
is on Instagram.
that's a huge value add. If you can get a forum with one of us to ask us questions, and Kurt is a wealth of knowledge around these topics, it seems like an easy no-brainer thing that I would do. Like if I had that when I was younger, hey, join this forum for a cheap price, and you could ask this guy that knows all the answers, and get yours and have good application. That would be uh, so valuable. So, anyway, Kurt, appreciate everything you're doing and putting out information and just raising the bar for PED knowledge and just kind of dismantling all the bro lore that's out there. And then thank you for your time to come on the podcast. I know you're a busy guy, so we appreciate it.
Thank you guys so much.
All right, everybody, we'll talk to you next time, and thank you for tuning in.